when it comes to going back to bonobos and looking at ways that maybe we weren't necessarily wired for monogamy, or that there were sections of hominids that weren't monogamous. Everyone kind of says, well, if you look at culture even now today and across the world, the only ones that are non-monogamous are led by men. So it'll be like one man, many women, but there's never the inverse. So it kind of perpetuates the idea that women don't have a proclivity towards sexuality, towards pleasure, towards non-monogamy, that non-monogamy is strictly a male desire or adherence.
Yeah, a lot of what happens is that people who make these kind of statements or claim to have found this evidence don't understand that they're projecting a set of cultural values onto the evidence that they're gathering.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, people often say, well, there are no matriarchal societies. So it's just natural that men are stronger, men are the leaders because there are all these patriarchal societies, but there are no matriarchal societies. The reason they don't see matriarchal societies is that they're looking for societies that are the mirror image of patriarchy. So they're looking for societies where there are dominant females who degrade the males and sort of rule, with an iron fist and, throw males into prison or burn them at the stake for doing things that they don't like. What they don't understand is that's not how women understand power. That's not how women work with power. And that's one of the things with bonobos. Bonobos are female dominant species, in the sense that when there's a limited amount of food, for example, in chimps, their dominant males decide who gets the food. They distribute it. In bonobos, the dominant females decide who gets the food, although normally it's just shared. If you throw a bag of food into a chimp enclosure in a zoo, all hell breaks loose. They fight. The dominant males take control of the food. They share it among themselves. Maybe they'll give some to a female if she's ovulating, because that's the only time she's of any sort of value to them, right? You throw a bag of food into an enclosure of bonobos, it causes stress, just like it does in chimps. But the way bonobos deal with stress is they all have sex with each other and then they share the food. Franz de Waal, who I mentioned earlier, said it really well. He said, chimps use violence to get sex, and bonobos use sex to avoid violence. Right? These are our two closest ancestors, or our two closest relatives. They're not really ancestors because they exist now. That's why I get so vehement about any discussion of primate origins of human behavior, including both of them, because they're so different, right? And if we ignore bonobos, people don't know there's this other possibility for human behavior, that there's a 50%, viability for this path forward rather than the chimp path forward. And people say, well, we're looking for, peace on earth. Well, peace on earth, you better look at sex and love and authenticity as well, or you'll never get to peace on earth.
Yeah, in the chimp empire, it was interesting because there was so they had two tribes that were kind of going at it and trying to fight for territory and resources. And you see like the stereotypical behavior out of most of the males, which is they are only engaged with the females when they're ovulating. Other than that, it gets a very means to an end relationship. But there was this one chimp that kind of started playing a different game. And what he did was he started to create friendships with the females, and he was engaging with them when they weren't ovulating. He'd help them with things. And
Right.
then even when they weren't ovulating, they would have sex with him. And then he ended up having just as many, if not more, offspring than the alpha, but no
Right.
one knew because he wasn't trying to be number one. He wasn't going at it in the more primitive ways. He kind of seemed a little bit more evolved, which I thought was fascinating. It was almost more human than some of the alphas. And then when I see the alphas, I'm like, some of those alphas look a lot like a lot of humans I see right now on TikTok, and this other creature is being a lot more evolved. So I wonder if there'll be another split where you do see some of these chimps that go more the path of the bonobo, where it's not so Machiavellian and it's just a little bit more like a little bit more abundant and sharing and not led with so much violence. Because as a human watching it, and you see the space and you see how many fruit trees there are and how ridiculous this idea of territories is, and you're like, whoa, if you scale that out, I wonder if you're an alien looking at us, they're saying the same thing, and how we see each other as other. And then that is the problem. We see everything through like famine and scarcity, and there's not enough pie for everyone. So we have to fight our neighbor instead of realizing there is just so much of everything. There's more than enough of everything. And if you went through it from a different lens and perspective, you wouldn't have all of this violence and bloodshed. And it's just totally avoidable, but they don't have the capacity to see beyond that.
Yeah, that makes me think of two interesting studies or observations by scientists. One is a study, I don't remember who did it. It's been years since I read it, but they were looking at, they were trying to sort of quantify how women look at men as potential mates, and they sort of assess their economic prospects, right? So what they did was they took maybe 50 men and they took photos of the men wearing like a suit and a tie and, haircut and all that kind of shit. And then took photos of the same men just looking kind of ratty, dirty t-shirt, haven't shaved for a while, whatever. And they showed women photos of these men quickly, just a flash. And the woman had to sort of like rate 1 to 5 how attractive she found the man, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they ran this through many, many women. And what they found was, okay, the women rated the same man much more attractive when he was in a suit and tie and all that. Okay. So what they're trying to prove is that this economic stuff is attractive to women. It's not just the guy, the way his face is and symmetry or whatever, right? But then someone who read this study, some graduate student somewhere, was like, well, what if we added a third group, which was the man, he's not like looking all ratty and like he's slept in his car, but he's also not, Mr. Businessman. He's just like, maybe he's like an artist, or he's clean and he's takes care of himself, but he's not in that economic game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out women found him to be the most attractive.
Mm.
So there's the sort of losers, there's the winners, and there's the guys who aren't playing the game at all, which a lot of women find to be the most attractive manifestation, right? So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. And again, you got to always look at the way the question's framed, right? Like, oh, there are no matriarchies in the world. Well, that's because you're looking for abusive women. Women wield power through consensus. Women don't want men to be below them. Women aren't as hierarchical. They're more inclusive. And there are societies in which women have the final say. The Iroquois, for example, which were the sort of bicameral structure of the American government with Congress and the Senate, came because Benjamin Franklin and other colonial political experts understood the way the Iroquois political system worked, and they copied that. And the way it worked is the men would have a council and sit in a circle, and the women sat around the men. The men would argue, deciding what are we going to do? Are we going to go to war? Are we going to move to this other, up to the lakes? Are we going to go here? Are we going to go there? And they would come to a decision, but the decision didn't hold unless the women agreed. And if the
Mm.
women said no, then the men had to go back and start arguing again and come up with another plan. The women had the final say, but they weren't doing the arguing, they were doing the final decision. That's reflected in the American political system. Most people don't know that, but that's a perfect example of how women can wield power. Anyway, the other study that is really one of the most sort of inspiring bits of scientific evidence I know of in this realm is by Robert Sapolsky, who teaches at Stanford. He's a neuroscientist, and he's been studying the same troop of baboons in Kenya for probably 30 years now, since he was a graduate student. He goes there every summer and he studies stress hormones in males based on where they are in the male hierarchy, because baboons are extremely hierarchical and rigid, male dominant, pretty violent. And what he does is he goes there with a blowgun and darts them and they pass out, and he takes blood samples and does this. So he's been doing this forever. And about probably 10 or 15 years ago now, the troop that he's been studying, they built a hotel for, safari tourism. And this troop sort of took over the dump of the hotel. And so he's seen this troop through generations, right? He's seen them, babies born, they get old and die, and new babies. He's just seen them come and come and come. So they've taken over this dump outside the hotel. And one year, there was some poison meat that was thrown into the dump. I think it had tuberculosis in it. And so meat is very valuable. So who gets the meat? The high status males, right? The top of the male hierarchy. All those males died. So suddenly you've got a baboon troop that only has lower ranking males who are by definition less violent. They're not abusing the females the way those alpha males do. Females and young. And so he thought, oh my God, this is going to be a massacre.